All right, well, thank you everyone for coming today. So this is our interviews seminar, which is part of the interviews program that we're developing. A lot of you were here last week and not last week, but the last seminar a couple weeks ago and heard more about the program. We can continue. These are really formatted to be informal discussions, smaller groups of people that are really going to engage in this program. So definitely formatted more like a discussion, and we can talk more today about the program if there's further questions. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mazdak Arabi from Civil Engineering, who will be talking about all sorts of interesting food, energy, water systems analysis kinds of things.
Thank you, Sebo, and thank you everybody for joining. It's a pleasure seeing you all here. Obviously, we know each other very well. We've worked on some of these projects together. So as we go through this, please take the opportunity to make this more interactive. Again, Dr. Passion has been involved intensively with this project. Megan is doing a lot of similar work for the Agolala watershed, and the rest of you guys have seen some of this work. So let's make it interactive as you want to discuss some points, things that could guide us as we go forward for the NRT project and NRT opportunities for students. I think that's the spirit of the seminars, as Sebel mentioned, to be able to figure out how to go forward, come up with interdisciplinary research topics that help our students to gain the skills needed to tackle this issue. So I get the title of Untangling Water Management with Food Production and Energy Systems in the West, but primarily what I will be presenting is the result of a previously funded project by NSF and NIFA, USDA NIFA, that we've been working on for nearly 7 years now. So I'll reflect on some of the things that we've learned, some of the modeling tools, predictive capacities, data analysis that we already have assembled and put together, and end with some research topics that we just worked on with Keith and Sid for an InTERFEWS project, is interdisciplinary food, energy, water systems, with a focus on food, energy, water systems in the West and interactions of the systems in arid and semi-arid regions. So this previous project, again, as I mentioned, Dr. Passion's group have been heavily involved in this. Focus on arid region river basins. Sorry guys, I couldn't get that bottom banner to go away. So hopefully by next time we'll learn. The third seminar is the chart model, right? We'll learn it. So the project was under the umbrella of Water Sustainability and Climate Projects funded by NSF. And what we proposed was that in Western River Basin, in arid and semi-arid regions, most of our river basins are either fully and in some cases over-appropriated. So as you know, the prevailing water management doctrine in these regions, including Western US, is prior appropriation. So every drop of water essentially has an owner, right? So if you want to use that water, reallocate the water, there's a whole bunch of institutional settings that must be complied with and met if you want to achieve that. Now, we are confronted in these regions by several external and regional factors that put pressures on our water resources. These include land use change. Perhaps the most common way of thinking about this is urbanization. We are rapidly urbanizing, and that comes with significant implications for land use change. Population growth. This is in particular important for semi-arid regions of the Western US. But if you look at the entire, for example, let's say continental US, population growth may not be a problem. Population decline may be the source of pressures on water systems. So changes in population, but we know that southwestern US is one of the fastest growing in terms of total population in the country. And these problems of land use change and population growth are exacerbated by changes in climate. And the way that at least we have formulated changes in climate are focused on two primary considerations. One is long-term changes in temperature and precipitation and factors that are influenced by those. So the climate anomalies are changing. We know our temperatures are changing and precipitation, but also climatic extremes. more extreme events in terms of droughts, longer, more frequent droughts, and also more intense and more frequent flooding events that put pressure on our water systems. And finally, the other factor that we have been thinking about and we have been studying is aging infrastructure. So somebody at a call the other day said, with regard to water management in general, but in the West, we have 19th century water laws, 20th century water infrastructure, and 21st century water issues and challenges. And there's a huge discrepancy between the way we manage our water. So that's really the underlying theme of a lot of research that we are doing. How we can bring all of these factors together based on interdisciplinary research to tackle some of these issues. So some of the questions, perhaps two primary questions of this previous work were how growing population and warming climate influence vulnerability of water systems to shortage, water quality degradation, and other factors. And then what is the future of agriculture? So essentially, we know that because of these pressures, particularly because of the water supplies pressures and vulnerability to shortage, water is coming out of agriculture. How can we sustain a vibrant agricultural economy? And what type of agricultural systems could be sustained over the course of next coming decades or perhaps next few centuries? So with that, we selected the South Platte River Basin. We live in the South Platte River Basin, as many of you guys know. Encompasses regions from South Denver to Fort Collins and some parts of Wyoming. This is an extremely attractive place to study water systems and related and linked systems, primarily because, or at least one of the important factors is that the river basins originate from the relatively pristine Rocky Mountains, and as the flow and the rivers run through our cities and communities, quantity and quality of water is influenced by urbanization and urban and municipal activities, industrial activities, and agricultural activities. So by the time that South Platte River Basin runs through Colorado, we have all of these mixed influences that we can study because we get a range and a gradient of human influences, climate influences, changes in topography and land use as evident here. So a quick note here, about 1/3 of water for the residents of the Front Range of Colorado comes from the western slope. So our water system not only are influenced by what happens in the system, but also by water transfers. The population of the region is growing really, really fast. We have doubled the population over the past couple of decades, and it's anticipated that by 2050, the population will double again. And like many other regions throughout the world, warming temperatures is a substantial, there are substantial trends in warming temperatures. Now, precipitation is also studied extensively for climate change and long-term trends, but there is less agreements among all of the climate models in terms of precipitation. So I'm just showing the more, the variable that there is more consistency in model outputs for climate models that you can see here. So if you look at all of this situation where there are changes in precipitation and temperature, changes in land use and population, obviously these are going to influence supply and demand for water, right? So overall, there are evidences both in terms of data and modeling efforts that we've done on the supply analysis, and we know supply is going down, and the supply is just noticing that the supply and demand in my balance needs to switch. So next again, by fourth presentation, I probably get it perfect. So supply from surface waters, groundwaters, added storage, and transparency in transfers. There are evidences that over the past couple of decades and in future, the supply will diminish to some level, and demands are increasing from cities, from farms and agricultural production. And obviously, we care a lot about our environment, leaving some water in the river to maintain and sustain healthy watersheds.
the water supply, so it shows it going in half by the end of the century? Is that?
No, the scale is not half. It's not.
Okay,
So it's diminishing.
Okay.
And I deliberately removed the scale here
Okay.
because I don't want people to get the numbers and
Yeah.
So this is the study that was conducted using several models by our group using the SWOT model, and also from the previous study by U.S. Forest Service working with Dr. Ramirez, that they looked at water supply conditions and vulnerability. So you can see again, water supply is going down, water demand is increasing. That band that you see is band of uncertainty around our projections, and we have more uncertainty in future, obviously. The same level of uncertainty also holds for water supply. I just didn't want to make that figure more complicated, right? The message is that if you look at the median or expected behavior of our systems, water supply is going to continue to diminish, water demand is going to continue to increase, and for an over-allocated water basin, river basin, this is a substantial problem, right? Water has to come from some sectors. So there are going to be sectors of economy, including agriculture, that is going to be influenced by the imbalance of water supply and demand. And historic analysis of historical data with regard to who owns water actually really corroborates this information. So if you look at historically how water rights have been transferred from one sector to another, you can see that by 1970s, we have essentially kind of stabilized in terms of the total number of endowments for direct flow rights from our rivers or getting water from our rivers, but municipalities are acquiring more and more of that share, and that's coming out of ag, as you can see here. And in terms of storage, reservoirs, essentially, you can see agriculture actually is going down, but municipalities are acquiring tremendous amount of storage water rights and total volume water rights that are available in this basin. So again, message here is that the pressure on our water systems is not in future. We already are confronted with that. The pressures are predominantly come from population growth and the fact that our municipalities are already growing. But then you add on top of that climate change, things are going to get a lot worse, right? So, and this is the evidence, this is historic data, no projection yet. Okay? So how do we cope with this? This is the famous tree that I use. Some of my friends, this is their joke. At every presentation I have to have this. That there are some low-hanging fruits. Okay, so the low-hanging fruits, in my opinion, are solutions that are regional and in-basin. Solutions that there is a lot more local and regional flexibility to develop and implement these strategies, this policy and institutional strategies. And these technologies and institutions are typically focused on conservation, reuse, and recycling, and some other type of technologies that I'll mention. Of course, a lot of water utilities are and municipalities and other sectors of the economy are interested in new supply, water supply systems, or enhancing the existing ones. But as many of you guys know, building reservoirs in this country requires environmental impact assessments, and they could be decade-long studies, as we are experiencing with the city of Fort Collins or Northern Colorado NIST system, right? So we've been going through the environmental impact studies for 2 decades now, and they are very sensitive for good reasons, right? Because we want to keep direct flows of water or native flows of water for ecological health of our system. And again, as I said, a lot of our river basins in the West, water comes from trans-basin water transfers. These are century-long agreements. These are not really very easy to renegotiate, right? So that's why I call the first set of solutions as the low-hanging fruit, because there is a lot more flexibility to put those in place. So again, our municipalities are growing. City water needs are tremendous. How do we cope with this increasing trends in municipal and related water use? Obviously, we can develop new water supply systems for cities. So primarily, we categorize these into three classes. One trend is buy and dry agricultural land and get the water from farmers. So what does that do? That takes land out of production, right? So when we talk about land management and the culture of rural-urban interface in this region, that's going to be substantially influenced by buy and dry type agreements, storage reservoirs, and groundwater pumping, right? So if you look at some of the results of the studies that Forest Service has done in the previous study, the main mechanisms throughout the country to cope with water shortages, both in short term and long term, has been groundwater mining, more tapping into perhaps non-renewable groundwater, which comes with its own implications. Now, increased groundwater pumping has not been a problem in the South Platte River Basin yet, but I'll talk about this in a few seconds. The second part is to reduce water demand, right? Improve end-use efficiency, both in agricultural systems by improved and enhanced irrigation infrastructure, or techniques and management schemes that influence the amount of water needed for irrigation of cropland, and in urban systems, end-use efficiency systems from appliances to landscape irrigation to many, many other things that we can do. We can reclaim and reuse some of the water that is used in urban settings, both for potable or non-potable purposes. We have one of the most renowned people in this field, Dr. Sharwal, who, I know her work very well for some good reasons. They have studied this tremendously, that what are viable and feasible pathways to adoption of technologies that foster reclamation of water and reuse. And then the concept of fit for purpose, right? We don't need to treat water to drinking water standards to be able to use that for toilet flushing or for landscape irrigation. And finally, there is another emerging topic in policy and institutions, and that is that instead of buying and drying agricultural land, maybe there are other alternative transfer methods that allows keeping agricultural land in production, but perhaps lease the water on a temporary basis, or inter-annual markets that would allow leasing water from ag to urban settings without permanently drying the land. Because right now, in many regions, semi-arid and arid regions, land use is completely tied with water use. So if you want to use some sort of water, you have to acquire the land, dry it, and sell that. So in Colorado, for example, many of you perhaps remember 3 or 4 years ago that our governor passed a small step towards allowing selling the water rights for 50% of what a farmer and landowner owns without selling the whole land, right? So decoupling water ownership from land use, that's something that people are thinking about. So some of these alternative transfer methods are being considered. So again, examples of what you can see in irrigation, water management, and again, we are blessed that Megan is leading a lot of the efforts with NRT, because the Ogallala Watershed Project is studying a lot of this type of technologies for irrigation. One of these that is very exciting for me is limited and deficit irrigation, for example. So some of these things we studied in our work, but there's a lot more coming out of this. Other studies, including what this coordinated agricultural project in Ogallala Watershed studied. So I thought maybe I'll show you an example of what you see here. You see a side-by-side field. The same region, the same farm, 2 fields, one with limited irrigation, the other one with full irrigation. And typically, historically, we've looked at maximizing yield either by water inputs or by nutrient inputs or other type of management. But as you can see here, although yield is higher for full irrigation, obviously in an arid and semi-arid region, water use efficiency perhaps can be optimized by adopting some limited or deficit or regulated deficit irrigation that people are working on in terms of technological systems that would foster those, or management behavior. We don't exactly know how timing of limited and deficit irrigation would influence those. So that's the topic of a lot of things that folks in soil and crop sciences and agricultural production systems are studying. Okay? Yes, sir.
Ignorant question.
Absolutely.
What is ET?
Evapotranspiration.
Okay.
So as you can see here, ET is essentially a measure of plant water use and the demand for for yield and biomass production. So as you can see here again, with full irrigation, you have more yield, but ET demand is higher, and then water use efficiency goes down in terms of pounds per acre per inch of water, or kilogram per hectare per millimeter of water applied. This is a field in somewhere here. I don't exactly know. This is one of the USDA ARS fields that we use their data for calibrating our models. I think it's in Greeley. Yeah, it's close to Greeley. Yeah. So Dr. Pashian's PhD student, Yao, helped us with calibrating our models for full irrigation and deficit irrigation in a variety of agroecosystems. And so this data has been tremendously useful for us. And in urban settings, again, to just give you an idea what we're talking about green infrastructure that allows us to capture stormwater, use that perhaps for landscape irrigation in the right of way or private properties. And on the right panel, what you can see here is City of Fort Collins, San Francisco. They have this concept of living machine that you essentially reclaim water, treat it to appropriate levels, and then apply that for landscape irrigation again. So some of these topics are also really emerging in cities. And we have several projects now in New York and other regions that we are looking at, cities that are really taking on these issues, because not just water shortage and water shortage vulnerability, but the impetus in some regions are flood control, in some regions are combined sewer systems, and so on, right? So these technological solutions can yield multiple benefits and co-benefits that one can consider. So the way that we tackle this interdisciplinary project from various aspects, we broke it down to three primary components: physical system, social systems, and economics. So you've heard this before. In the physical system, we had a number of complex modeling systems that inform the biophysical response of our system to changes in climate, land use, and so on. So you can see models that we've used or data that we have used. For example, for crop growth, we used the famous descent model that has been developed at CSU. Keith's group have improved the descent model for soil moisture condition and plant response to those improved conditions, and that was used for crop production functions, essentially, in response to irrigation. In terms of political and social aspects, we looked at agreements, water rights. So you'll see that the primary umbrella model reconciles behaviors and decisions with water rights and water course and water allocation. And then some of the things that we're doing now is, as a part of another project that we just have proposed, is to get into how decisions are influenced by these conditions. And these decisions are multi-scale. So you have small scale, perhaps field scale or farm scale or utility level scale, to regional scale or river basin, and you have national scale policies, right? So we are using a combination where we are hoping that we could use as a part of this NRT sets of projects or other projects that we are pursuing. And Keith and Sid and many others are involved in that project too, to study how decisions are made across scales and how policies that are set at the state or national scale will start promoting activities that will transition or foster the transition towards a more sustainable future. So we are using game theoretical models in that effort, reconciled with some of these agent-based modeling systems that we have done before. Again, the good thing here is that some of these are also being used for the Ogallala Watershed Project or Ogallala Aquifer Project, the CAP project. And all of this, again, are linked with a computable general equilibrium economic model that essentially allowed us to measure how various decisions eventually influence economic indicators, right? The broader economy, as one can imagine. Very quick demonstration of or illustration of our integrated assessment framework, where we start with changes in land use, climate, and energy policy and scenarios, and we simulate the biophysical system in the context of the socioeconomic factors and institutions that control or govern the allocation of water. And eventually we measure things like vulnerability to water shortage or resiliency of a system. So resiliency is when we talk about changes in the system and how system can recover its functions after some sort of a shock to the system. Cost, equity, affordability, and then again, one of the things that we haven't done fully yet, but we are getting into a lot more rigorously is likelihood of adoption, decisions at multiple scales, right? So how people make those decisions. So the overarching system or modeling capacity that brought everything together. So as you saw, we had a list of very complex, comprehensive models for various biophysical, social, and economic sectors. But what linked all of them together is that water rights market that we have put together in the South Platte River Basin. So this is essentially an optimization model that incorporates the physical infrastructure with changes in use and transaction costs. Is a pseudo agent-based model. So Chris Bowmans is involved with this NRT, and Dale Manning from our Ag Econ departments. They've worked with our students in the civil engineering department to develop these models. These models are informed by those crop production functions that Kit's team has helped us to develop, urban water demand functions that Sevil's team has developed. So you can see that all of these multiple disciplines need to be reconciled in some sort of a decision model. This is essentially a decision model, right? It's a pseudo agent-based model that mimics real allocation and use of water and transfer of water rights among sectors. So in this case, water going from ag production to municipalities, but could go the other way. We just happen to know that in this region that doesn't happen, right? So again, this is a pseudo agent-based model. It's a multi-objective optimization with equilibrium constraint optimization problem. So there has been some really neat advancements that we've done to be able to make that work. So you can see that this the situation, the constraints include constraints in municipalities and agricultural production. For example, in the South Platte River Basin, as I said, 1/3 of our water comes from western slope via a system called the Big Thompson Project, right? What was the exact? Colorado Big Thompson Project, CBT water. So when you see CBT, thank you, Neil. If you have any questions about water, you know who to ask.
Yeah.
Okay? You know. So CBT water has some limits on CBT, the use of CBT water, which is excellent. It's water coming from, is transferred from western slopes. The limits on CBT water for municipal use. There are some limits on it. Okay? We can't use all of that for municipalities. So you see some of the constraints on the municipal use and some of the constraints in the agricultural use. Obviously, again, this is a water rights prior appropriation doctrine. You have senior water use and junior water uses. You can't use the water if you have more senior uses under scarcity. So about 45 municipal districts are incorporated in this model and 300 irrigation districts. This is a very difficult problem to solve in an optimization engine when you're doing you're essentially simulating decisions. So the system is working, and you can see some of that results in some of our publications. So to just show you some of the results and motivate our conversation, we've looked at various scenarios or strategies that reconcile technological solutions with policy solutions. So in what I'm listing here, which is a subset of what we've studied, Obviously, baseline is our basis for comparison of efficiencies and effectiveness, right? So that's always there. But we studied things like what happens if the state says no more buy and dry. Ag land, we want to preserve it, is extremely important. Obviously, this is a very top-down type policy, is not preferred approach. So one of our papers that has been really of particular interest is comparison of top-down policies like no buy and dry, keep the ag in production with a flexible market with more efficient technologies. And what we've learned is that actually market-driven approaches kind of maintains the ag if you allow enough flexibility in the institutional and policy setting. So we've tried to answer some of these questions by formulation of these strategies. As I said, the second option that you can see here, 50% buy and dry, is that regulation I talked about that our governor passed, that you can lease 50% of your water without selling your land, right? So that was something that was motivated by that. We also looked at what happens if you don't have any M&I constraints on CBT water, and what you can see. One of the issues that was particularly interesting for me, and I had no idea before we started this project, is this raw water requirement in a lot of regions. As you develop land for urban communities, you have to acquire raw water, right? So this raw water requirement, we've learned, is the most important constraint in efficient management of our water. Because this raw water requirement is the same for all communities, regardless whether they use more efficient technologies for buildings, gray water reuse, or black water reuse, or not. They all have to acquire the same water. So the question is, if they acquire water, why would they conserve it? They already purchased the water needed for building the community, right? So a lot of these things that are not trivial and one cannot think about or doesn't think about, you learn as a part of this integrated, interdisciplinary projects. So we study things like how much efficiency we can gain by reducing 10% of raw water requirements or 20% of raw water requirements. So in our optimization schemes, you'll see this multiple objective Pareto frontier approaches the origin under some of these policy improvements. So some of the results under the baseline scenario, things that, again, I had no idea before this project, and we've learned as we've gone forward, is that in our systems, if you look at how much a farmer makes or earns, the revenue for a farmer, but just directly selling their water rights versus crop production is unbelievable. The water rights have tremendous amount of value for farming communities and rural communities. As a matter of fact, what we've learned is that, as you can see in the right panel, a farmer, if they want to gain the value of just simply selling their water right to municipalities, they have to keep the land in full production for 40 years. Right? So you have 40 years of ag activity and labor and all of those to have the same revenue, net present value, for selling the water. And if you own CBT water, which is a lot more flexible, that's not tied to the land, so it's much more easy to sell it from one sector to another, that's actually a lot more valuable, as you can see. So message, this type of integrated projects allow us to answer a lot of questions with regard to how policies can improve various sectors of economy or promote some sort of technologies or impede adoption of some of these technologies. Yes, sir.
Go back to previous. Yeah. I'm concerned about the implications of what I'm seeing on the left. The opportunity cost for farming is so low.
Yeah.
Right? Meaning, I should, our opportunity cost is pretty high. I shouldn't be farming if I own land.
Again, I mentioned this last week in another seminar. You hear that, and Neil would attest to this. In this region, if you do something that impacts the value of water and water rights, farmers say, don't touch my water rights. It's a big political and very sensitive issue. This is why. Because that water has so much value that if you do anything that influences that, the value of water, essentially, there's a lot of pushback on that. Now, it's reality. It's the demand goes up, the price of water goes up, the potential gain by specific farmers and landowners goes up, right? So that's the way our setup system works. Also, this is linked with what type of crops we grow. Now, this is, I have to admit here that this is not a full characterization of rural expenditure and economy. There are other ripple effects of agricultural activities, right? So that's not included here. There are other things like, again, as I mentioned last week, we don't grow alfalfa here because it's economically very valuable and we can sell it to China, for example. It's because it's feed for livestock production. So there is a secondary market in place, right, that is influenced by this. And these are the new type of analysis that we are hoping to incorporate in our system via our new InTERFEWS project or the NRT project and other ongoing work that we do. So understanding why is that we should continue agricultural production and how that is linked with social, economic, and policy.
Yeah, that's where I was headed with my question. Right?
Absolutely.
It's really.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure, absolutely. So again, to just keep in mind that when we evaluate and assess, see, this is again very much directly in response to what you just said. It's not just revenue for farmer, but it's the viability of rural economy in general, rural expenditure. Many of us want to live in smaller communities and agricultural lifestyle, right? I'm not one of them. I grew up in a city of 15 million people, so I get nervous when people don't hit me in the shoulder when I'm walking the sidewalk. So you can see rates of water, cost of water. One of the significant issues that we are adding to our projects, again, as a part of these new efforts, is affordability, social, environmental justice considerations, and so on. Right. So you can see that by some adaptation strategies, we could actually increase the revenue produced by crops compared to the value of water. If we reduce demand, we have less demand, value of water goes down, right? But that can be compensated by crop production and things like that. So that's essentially, this is kind of getting at what you were talking about. Technological solutions, policy, and social systems make a huge difference on pathways towards achieving the outcomes that you can see some of them listed here. So again, this is what you can see here. The observed trends in ag land in the South Platte River Basin has been going down. Our model predicts by 2050, 2060, all ag land in the South Platte is gone. So for those who love to live in an urban agriculture interface, not going to happen unless we take some adaptation strategies. What you can see here, some of the solutions, and as a matter of fact, some of them have been completely counterintuitive for me. Urban water conservation ranks highest in every time that you look at the solutions. By reducing demand from urban areas and municipalities, you help ag communities to keep their land in. And then obviously irrigation in cropland irrigation technologies, and then the least effective yet effective, but the least effective is adding more storage. As our water supply is going down, we may not even have enough water to store. So storage becomes effective for handling interannual variability, but not a solution for long-term viability of our systems. Again, for me, this has been very counterintuitive, the in-basin solutions. And finally, even with that, you can see by 2100, almost all ag will go out because we have so much population coming in. So then we are talking about tapping more into groundwater. Right now, our system is mostly surface water driven. As we tap into groundwater, we are learning that we can keep a lot more. So we are doing a study right now to see how groundwater will respond to increased pumping to keep the same ag land in place. And we are learning that we can actually maintain a lot of it by groundwater. But what is the problem with groundwater? As we use more groundwater than surface water, remember, our surface water is gravity driven, not much energy from it. Well, you tap into groundwater, energy cost goes up, greenhouse gases go up, a lot of these environmental aspects go up. What else is the primary concern in your mind? Yeah, so the return flows are influenced, that's correct. But even
Land
something,
use. Right?
sure.
How am I going to accommodate population while finding places to access groundwater?
Yeah, so the competition is not just for water, it's also for the land. People need places to live. One of the things that has been the demise of a lot of agricultural production system has always been salinity. If you study for 2,000 years, what has put agricultural production systems in arid and semi-arid regions out of production has been salinity. We recycle more water, which is included in some of the solutions, reclamation of water and applying that again and recycling that. And then you have more groundwater. Well, you're recycling salts. Salt builds up in soils, and that could be a tremendous problem as we go forward. Okay, so this is the very specific objectives of what we are doing in our new project, and we're hoping that some students will join the NRT team to be able to study how salinity in the Western US will influence crop production systems and how we can come up with maybe cropping system and things of that sort that influence that. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
So,
Oh, she's my boss.
Much better second time around.
Oh, third time you love it.
That's a friendly improvement.
yeah. So the demand for water for agriculture is much higher than urban demand currently in Colorado. This analysis is for Colorado, yeah?
This South Platte, yeah.
South Platte, okay. So, and is that the case for the South Platte? Is that also
Yeah,
the case?
still water use is dominated by ag production.
Okay. So how is it then that the urban demand reduction strategies are so much more effective?
Because when you have a water rights market like this, when you have a pseudo-agent-based model that is mimicking transfer of water, demands matter and supply matters too.
Okay.
If the demand is reduced, the transfer is automatically reduced. And we're talking about cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
So cost is a big factor in this as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? So obviously irrigation water conservation is also very, very good. But transfer of water from ag to urban has transaction costs. Currently, you have to go to courts, water courts pay transaction costs. Plus, you need hydraulic infrastructure for conveyance, right? So when you look at those transaction, physical infrastructure, and change of use transaction costs, then the solutions that you'll see here with regard to urban demand conservation, that's a no-brainer. If you want to really promote keeping ag in land, first make our cities more efficient. That's the message, because of transaction costs and so on.
So I actually have a question about your tree, your apple tree. What
you like it, huh? I stole it from someone else. You're welcome to use it.
But I wonder if your low-hanging fruit is really low-hanging fruit, just because when you're talking about, for example, irrigation technology, conservation adoption, we've known that stuff for decades, right?
Sure.
And we don't get adoption. And largely it's because we don't have the policy or some of the top-down or some sort of limit that incentivizes it. So I guess I'm just saying that as we think about, building a reservoir, it's politically really hard, but once you got it, you've got something, whereas that decentralized thing is
Megan is
really
referring to something that is extremely important, and that is what policies promote or impede adoption of the solutions. When you're talking about reservoir systems, few people make the decisions. So you can mobilize them, you can motivate them, you can get it done. When you're talking about decentralized systems, you have multi-scale decisions and many stakeholders that you have to bring together. So absolutely, this is assuming political systems and institutional agreements are in place that foster this, right? So we are first learning what technologies are most efficient and effective. And then now we're at a point with that multi-scale decision modeling. So I don't want to get to too much of the detail. We propose a Stackelberg game theoretical model that says what national and state policies and first moves then will trickle down to actions on farm and things of that sort. In terms of conservation and ag production, we've done this for many, many years. People have looked at age, income, size of farm, And we've learned that, it varies across the country, right? So it's hard though, absolutely.
Just to add, so Republican River Basin, for example, that has to meet state compact, they are much more comfortable saying we're going to retire X amount of acres as opposed to incentivizing the uncertainties around conservation.
So
yeah.
Excellent point. Dana Hogg in AgEcon and we did a study across 18 watersheds in the United States to study why people adopt or don't adopt things that they already know is more effective. So he calls it wedges in the decision process. So from a market point of view, you have a supply and demand curve that intersects. You have a viable market, but you have wedges that pulls the market away, right? These are lack of trust in government, uncertainty in future conditions. And we characterize this under 7 categories of wedges that takes the market out of supply-demand balance, essentially. So absolutely right. That's very important. But we've learned that when the pressure gets to a certain point, people start responding. States in California after 2000, when was it? 2012 or whatever, when the governor said everybody has to use 25% conservation, right? So there are ways that governments and local agencies respond, and then how influences. One of the things we are learning is that how this knowledge and how these interactions from one skill to another influence. And to me, that's one of the beautiful things that this NRT should answer for a variety of problems, not just water, but again, as you will see here, I've listed for energy. Renewable-based energy policies tremendously influence water use, right? We heard on that call the other day that a lot of times you have an electricity bill that you pay in advance. So you pay the cost of pumping. You're going to pump the groundwater, right? So in the absence of an integrated groundwater management with energy policy, water use is going to be influenced by that. So again, going back to some of these things that I'm hoping, or we are hoping, that this NRT, our new InTERFEWS project that Keith and Sid and others are involved, and other projects collectively we can answer is some of these decentralized systems for water at work in the context of centralized systems, right? So end-use efficiency, fit for purpose, alternative water resources, energy systems, particularly microgrids and aggregation. There are really good examples in California that are emerging that could provide a roadmap going forward. In the ag sector, Keith and I have been talking about simulating this for cropping system, what crop choices and varieties can be viable in the Western US, how deficit and limited irrigation can work, and livestock production practices. As I mentioned, livestock is a huge economic impetus for some particular crops. And then integrated policy and institutions. These are things that we are working on, and we are hoping to expand. Water rights optimization, different type of water rights going from public allocation to marginal cost pricing and so on. Renewable energy policy, again, if you promote more solar and wind, does that reduce? Because the cost of energy is directly influenced by amount of water and cost of water and so on. So risk sharing between the energy sector and water sector and so on. So again, I'll just quickly mention that if you want to do this, we have to do integrated interdisciplinary work. There is no other way of doing it, right? And that's why in this InTERFEWS, project has been focusing on this system approach and system thinking process where you think about global drivers, regional pressures, state, both in terms of biophysical, social, political, and technological state of a system with impacts. So one can think about triple bottom line impacts that fit in this framework, and then responses, technological or policy that I mentioned some of those that can emerge. And then we need to reconcile this with system analysis and system characterization using optimization and decision analysis. So this is directly from our other project that we're pursuing, but I think that project is focused on modeling what kind of system will be viable in Western US. It's a very good complementary project to this that can go forward together. So I just want to highlight the importance of the system thinking. That's not good enough to optimize delivery of services to one sector. We need to think broader in terms of impacts of actions, both in terms of technologies and policies on this state of our system. So with that, I stop. I know I used almost all of my time, but we had some conversation too. So. I have nothing to do. It's Friday afternoon. My next step in my Friday afternoons, when I get to one, is wings and beer. Priority.
Why always call you on Friday afternoon? Because you answer the phone. Quick question though.
Sure.
So when you're doing the economics on this stuff, how much does it matter what time horizons you look at, or obviously discount rates are going to be really important, right? But I was thinking about the urban, reuse, and if there's capital costs to build infrastructure, but then after that it becomes cheap, but there's a big capital upfront cost versus the ag land, water is there, it's cheap, but there's,
Absolutely. So Kit's question is, what is the time scale for assessment when you're thinking about various technologies and infrastructure that the upfront cost of design and implementation and things of that sort may be very high, but after that you have a much more reliable system and perhaps cheaper, right? So our time scale for the previous study has been decadal assessment. Okay. And for infrastructure, we have 50-year or appropriate planning horizons. So costs are computed for what is the anticipated or expected life and service of that infrastructure. And then we present that either for a specific time or net present value in comparisons. But that's something that is extremely important. We know that once infrastructure systems are built, you have to pay the bonds and other things. You can't go back. So locking of assets and funds and funding becomes a very, very important issue. In general, in terms of urban sustainability, this is what people have talked about, locking of assets in cities and municipalities, and get this butterfly cycle of you get to a maximum locking, and then you have a collapse of that system, then you have to regenerate and go through that system. But our approach has been to look at decadal assessments. So all of this analysis that I've showed, you saw that we have decadal assessments. The other points are not every year. That doesn't make sense, right? You have decadal assessments with characterization of the overall cost of infrastructure for their planning and service horizon. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your Friday and happy spring break, huh?